Guys, I want to know, where are you watching from? If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Thanks. My name is Aaron, and for nearly 3 years I worked as the caretaker of the old Ashram Bell Tower on the edge of the northern ridgeline, above the village of Falgun. It's not the kind of job you find in newspapers or online listings. My uncle handed it to me when he got too sick to climb the 132 steps to the bell chamber each day. The tower itself sat at the end of a winding trail, past terraced fields, and into a clearing lined with gnarled pipal trees. A relic from a time before the wars, before concrete, before all the noise. No one lived nearby. It was just me, the bell, and the wind that whistled through the gaps in the stone walls. My duties were simple. Keep the place clean, ring the bell each morning and at sundown, and make sure the structure stayed sound. Once a week, I'd walk into the village to fetch supplies, send letters, and check on my grandmother, who was too blind to know who I was most days. That was my routine, lonely but dependable. In the second week of Chaitra, during the festival of winds, my grandmother asked me to visit her cousin in Serval. "Take a few days," she said, "stretch your legs." I almost didn't go. Leaving the tower unattended even for a short while made me uneasy. But eventually I agreed. I was gone for 5 days. When I returned, something felt shifted. The steps were covered in more dust than they should have been. The latch on the west-facing window in the bell chamber was broken and swung loosely in the breeze. But most of all, I noticed the bell itself had been cleaned, not by the wind or by time, but deliberately. The tarnish had been wiped away. Smudges gone. Someone had touched it. At first, I assumed it was a passing pilgrim. People still visited occasionally, believing the bell granted clarity to those who rang it with an honest heart. But something didn't sit right with that explanation. No offerings had been left. No sandalwood or rice or incense, just silence. On the third night back, I heard footsteps on the stairs. It was well past midnight. I was in my cot, reading by an oil lamp. At first I thought I was imagining it. The stone steps, creaking in slow, deliberate rhythm, one after the other ascending. No voices, just steps. I held my breath and waited. They stopped outside my door. I rose, heart slamming against my ribs, and crept to the door. It was shut. I hadn't heard it open. I hadn't heard anything after the last footstep. I forced myself to swing it open. No one. Nothing. I checked the staircase. Empty. I checked the bell chamber. Empty. I barely slept that night. The next evening, while cleaning, I found a satchel tucked beneath one of the wooden benches. It wasn't mine. Inside was a faded sketchbook, a few broken pencils, and a rusted brass coin the size of my palm. The name R. Jeevan was written in careful, looping script inside the front cover. I hadn't heard that name in years. Jeevan had been my uncle's predecessor, a quiet man who'd vanished one winter without warning. People said he'd simply wandered off, grown tired of isolation. Others whispered darker stories, that he'd gone mad, that the bell had swallowed his spirit. I never knew him, but I remembered his name. I didn't mention any of this to the villagers during my next supply run. What would I say? That I heard footsteps and found a dead man's belongings? But the feeling grew worse. I started seeing someone in the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. A figure still as stone, watching. Always in the same place, near the pipal roots. Tall, cloaked in dark robes, face obscured. Each time I tried to approach, he disappeared. One night I was jolted awake by the sound of the bell. It was loud, violent, ringing with a rhythm I hadn't heard before. Faster, Urgent. I ran upstairs barefoot, breath ragged, skin damp. But the chamber was empty. The bell was still swinging. I ran to the edge and looked down. No one. The next day, I packed my things. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. I left the satchel on the bench, locked the door to the chamber, and descended the steps for what I hoped was the last time. That night I stayed in the village. I didn't sleep. At dawn I heard it again. The bell. From across the valley I heard the distinct echo of it ringing. Once, then twice, then silence. I never returned to the tower. I took a job at the grain mill where there's always someone. Nearby, always noise and motion, but sometimes in the quietest moments I still hear it. That single deep note. I don't know who rings it now, and I don't want to know. I hadn't planned on staying out that late. The night markets in Hanwha spilled past midnight, but it was already close to 5 when I finally left the after-party at Lena's art studio. My feet ached from standing in chunky boots all night, and the neon tang of rice wine still coated my tongue. I wasn't drunk, not exactly, just worn down and foggy, like someone had dimmed the lights inside my head. I got off the tram 2 stops early because the noise was too much, walked the rest of the way home, and barely noticed the dogs barking as I passed the alley behind the old bookstore. My building was quiet like always. A 6-story hulk of concrete painted a pale yellow that hadn't seen a fresh coat in a decade. I keyed in the door code, stumbled up 3 flights, and dropped everything in the corridor. Shoes, bag, even my coat. I just needed to lie down. My apartment was small but open. I left the lights off and collapsed on the tatami mat in the corner that doubled as my couch. Head pounding, stomach twisting. I popped 2 herbal tablets from the tin my grandmother sent me and shut my eyes. Sleep didn't come, not right away. Then the buzzer rang. At first I thought I imagined it, but it buzzed again, long, loud, and insistent. I didn't move. I just lay there, face buried in the pillow, telling myself it was probably someone drunk hitting the wrong unit. But it kept going. 5 times. Then silence. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I don't know how long I was out, but when I opened my eyes again, everything felt wrong. My mouth was dry. My arms were heavy. And the apartment was darker than it should have been, even with the curtains drawn. That's when I saw it. A thin line of white stretching across the floor coming from the entryway. The door wasn't shut. I sat up, every muscle in my body suddenly alert. I never leave that door open. Never. Before I could move, I heard it. A creak above me, then another. I live on the top floor. No one should be walking upstairs. I dropped to the floor behind the low table and stayed there, heart racing. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crossed the ceiling. Then silence. Then more footsteps, this time heavier, closer to the stairwell. My mind was trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone got in through the roof, maybe maintenance. But no. Then I heard voices, 2 of them. Men speaking softly, too softly to make out what they were saying, but one of them laughed. Just a small, low chuckle. Like they were making themselves at home. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I heard drawers open, cabinets. Something metal clinked onto the floor. The clatter made one of them curse. They were going through my things. I had no idea what to do. My phone was in my coat pocket, out in the hallway. If I tried to get it, they'd see me. If I stayed where I was, maybe they wouldn't. Then the worst happened. One of them came into the main room. I could see his shadow stretch across the wall as he passed. He didn't look behind the table. He barely glanced around. Just started. opening boxes I kept by the bookcase, old zines, camera gear, random junk. My heart was a drumline in my ears. He moved closer. I saw the hem of his coat as he stopped right next to me. I could smell the cigarette smoke on him. He bent down, rummaging through something I couldn't see. If he turned his head even a little, he'd spot me. Then the second guy called him from the kitchen. He stood up and walked away. I didn't move. Not for what felt like forever. Eventually, I heard them both again, now back by the entrance. One of them said something about nothing worth it here, and then the door creaked open and closed. I still waited. Just to be sure. When I finally crawled out from behind the table, my knees were shaking. I grabbed my coat, pulled out my phone, and called the neighborhood security patrol. My voice cracked as I spoke, but I kept it together enough to give my address. Later, the security guy told me they'd likely been watching the building, maybe even tracking who came and went. I always walked to work. They probably thought I'd be gone all night when they didn't see my usual morning routine. They didn't take much, just a speaker, a few things from the kitchen, nothing irreplaceable. But I keep thinking, what if I hadn't fallen asleep in that exact spot? What if I'd gotten up when the buzzer rang? I live alone. That never used to scare me. Now every time I hear footsteps in the stairwell, I pause. I listen. And I wait. I spent that summer on the island of Mahagana, helping my cousin Sifa repair his battered old fishing boat. We were both in between things. Him, between fishing seasons, and me, between jobs and decisions I didn't want to make. The days were long and smelled like seaweed, fuel, and rust. By the time the sun slipped behind the jagged cliffs each evening, we were usually covered in salt and sweat, arms sore from sawing and hauling. Sifa lived in a squat wooden house built on stilts above the waterline. There were no neighbors nearby, just mangroves stretching out in all directions, their tangled roots twisting like arthritic fingers. It was peaceful in a way that made you forget to check your phone or count the hours. The nights were thick with insect noise and far-off splashes. The place was old but solid. Homey. Safe, I thought. One night after a long day welding the boat's cracked frame, I stayed back while Sifa went to check his crab traps along the estuary. It was almost midnight, and I was sitting cross-legged on a pandan mat inside the house, eating fried cassava and flipping through a water-stained novel someone had left behind. The only light came from a small oil lamp swaying slightly with the breeze. The dog, Bantu, was sprawled out near the door, snoring. Then suddenly, he jolted awake. At first, I figured he'd just heard something outside. Maybe one of the herons that nested in the trees near the water. But Bantu was tense, his ears raised, and he gave a low, steady growl as he padded to the back shutter. He stood there, tail stiff, staring through the gaps in the slats. I walked over and opened it, half expecting to see a monkey or maybe a wild pig. But there was nothing. Just darkness and the shifting shadows of mangrove leaves moving in the breeze. The water below was calm, black and silent. I shut the shutter and gave Bantu a pat. Just your imagination, boy. But he didn't move. He kept staring, watching. About 10 minutes passed. I tried to ignore him and went back to my book. Then the front door creaked. It didn't swing open, not all the way, but it definitely moved. I froze. It was subtle but unmistakable. I stood up. Bantu whined low in his throat and backed into the corner. I slowly walked over to the door and nudged it closed again, checking the latch. Locked. I tested it twice, then turned around. And that's when I noticed the trap door. The hatch in the floor, the one we only opened to haul up baskets or rinse gear, was cracked open just an inch. I hadn't touched it. I knew it had been shut. I walked toward it, heart pounding louder with every step. There were wet footprints on the wooden floorboards. Bare feet, small, fast, leading from the trapdoor, across the room, then vanishing. Near the back shutter, no smudges, no trail, just gone. Bantu started barking, loud and panicked now, and scrambled under the wooden bench where Sefa stored tools. I backed away from the hatch and grabbed the machete we kept by the kitchen door. My hands were shaking. I didn't want to lift that door open. I didn't want to know what might be below. I crouched near it, blade raised, and yanked it fully, open with one hard pull. Nothing. Just black water. I looked down for a long time, watching for bubbles, ripples, anything. But there was no movement. No sound. Just the slow creak of the house settling above water, like it always did. I should have stayed calm. Should have convinced myself it was the wind or my imagination. But my chest was tight and my skin felt too small for my body. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just missed something, that someone had been inside the house. Close enough to touch. I grabbed Bantu, who yelped when I pulled him out, and ran barefoot down the narrow plank bridge that led to the sandbanks. The tide had gone out, leaving behind thick, muddy flats. I didn't stop until I reached the caretaker's hut near the old watchtower. An elderly couple lived there, the only other people on this side of the island. I pounded on their door until the man opened it in a half-buttoned shirt, holding a lantern and looking confused. After I explained, he let me in without question. The next morning, we went back with a few men from the village. They searched the house. Nothing was missing. No damage. But the footprints were still there. Half faded now. They disappeared near the window, like the person had flown out instead of climbed. And the strangest thing? There was a tiny carved figure left beside the trapdoor. Something made of coral and bone. Nothing anyone recognized. Sefa was angry at first, said maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a fish jumping near the hatch. But Bantu wouldn't go back inside for weeks. He paced the boardwalk, whined at night, and refused to sleep anywhere near the water. We never figured out what happened. Some of the older islanders started talking about a tenga, things that live in the mangroves and climb up through the cracks in the world when the tide is just right. I don't know if I believe in that, but I know what I saw, and I know how it felt. I left the island a week later. Haven't been back since. But every once in a while, just before I fall asleep, I'll hear a creak in the floorboards, or a soft splash through my open window, and I'll remember that trapdoor, that crack, that one slow breath of water waiting.